February 12, 1963, 11:15 a.m., 125th Street and Lenox Avenue. The entire city block felt like a bomb waiting to detonate. Thousands of people lined the sidewalks pressed shoulder to shoulder, their breath misting in the biting February cold. They weren't there for parade. They weren't there for parade. They were there for resurrection. In the back of a black Cadillac Fleetwood, creeping through the crush of bodies, sat Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. He had been a ghost for 10 years, locked away in the freezing isolation of Alcatraz. Now, he was back on the pavement he used to own. But the man waiting for him at the corner of 125th Street wasn't cheering. Chauncey, the Saint Shone, sat in a booth at the window of the Palm Cafe, stirring his coffee. He checked his watch. He checked the 3 men positioned across the street on the rooftop of the Hotel Teresa. They had high-powered rifles wrapped in painter's drop-cloths. "He doesn't step out of that car," Chauncey whispered to his lieutenant. "The moment his foot touches the curb, you end the legend." The stakes were absolute. Control of the $50 million a year heroin trade that had exploded while Bumpy was away. Chauncey had 10 minutes to kill the king before the king realized his throne had been stolen. 3 weeks earlier, to understand the volatility of that morning, you have to understand the vacuum Bumpy Johnson left behind. When the federal marshals dragged him away in 1952, sentenced to 15 years for a drug conspiracy he likely didn't commit, Harlem lost its gravity. Bumpy wasn't just a gangster, he was the professor. He was the mediator who kept the Italian families from completely devouring the independent black numbers bankers. He walked with a limp, quoted Shakespeare, and carried a switchblade that moved faster than the eye could follow. He was the devil Harlem knew, and, in a strange way, trusted. By 1963, the landscape had mutated. The honorable thieves were gone, replaced by wolves. The Genovese family, led by the cunning Vito Genovese, though he was facing his own legal troubles, had empowered a new breed of local enforcers. These weren't men of the community. They were ruthless opportunists who flooded the streets with low-grade heroin, ignoring the old rules about keeping drugs away from schools and churches. The neighborhood was suffering. The addiction rate had tripled. The stakes of Bumpy's return were existential for the new regime. If Bumpy came home and reclaimed his spot, the new management would be fired permanently. The Italians were watching closely from their social clubs in East Harlem. They knew Bumpy was the only man capable of uniting the fractured black underworld against them. If he lived through his homecoming, the free ride was over. The entire ecosystem of organized crime in New York City hinged on whether an old man could survive his first day of freedom. Chauncey the Saint John was the face of this new, brutal Harlem. He earned his nickname not for piety, but because he dressed like a deacon-pristine 3-piece suits, gold spectacles, and a soft, sermon-like voice. But his actions were demonic. In 1960, he had solidified his power by locking 18 rival dealers in a basement in the Bronx and setting the building on fire. He didn't watch it burn. He went to dinner while they screamed. Chauncey wanted what Bumpy had, the crown. But he wanted it without the responsibility. He didn't want to settle disputes or pay rent for widows. He wanted raw profit. Bumpy represented the old school, a code of conduct that Chauncey viewed as a weakness. To Chauncey, Bumpy was a dinosaur returning to a world of meteors. He was dangerous because he had the backing of the Genovese capo, Fat Tony Salerno. Chauncey had resources. Bumpy couldn't match, fresh out of prison, corrupt precinct captains on the payroll, a fleet of new Lincolns, and an army of young, hungry soldiers who had never known the fear of Bumpy Johnson. They only knew the stories, and stories don't stop bullets. The threat had been delivered to Bumpy's wife Mamie a week prior. A funeral wreath was left on the steps of their apartment at the Lenox Terrace. The ribbon didn't say, "Rest in peace." It read, "Welcome home to the graveyard." February 12, 1963, 11:25 a.m. Chauncey's plan relied on the chaos of the crowd. He knew the community would turn out. He counted on the noise and the confusion to mask the sniper fire. The plan was to drop Bumpy right in front of the Apollo Theater's symbolic execution on the most famous stage in Black America. The scene on 125th Street was a sensory overload. The cold air smelled of roasted peanuts from street vendors and the exhaust of idling Chevrolets. The sound was deafening a roar, thousands chanting, "Bumpy! Bumpy!" that vibrated against the shop windows. It was a hero's welcome for a criminal, a testament to how desperate the people were for leadership. Inside the Palm Cafe, the air was stale with cigarette smoke and nervous sweat. Chauncey sat at table number 4, tapping his spoon against the saucer. Clink, clink, clink. He's passing the Teresa, the lieutenant said, peering through the blinds. 2 minutes out. At 11:27 a.m., the black Cadillac slowed to a crawl. The crowd pressed in, touching the car like it was a holy relic. At 11:28 a.m., Chauncey gave the signal. He dropped a white handkerchief on the table. Across the street, 3 floors up on the Hotel Teresa, the snipers adjusted their scopes. They had a clean line of sight to the curb where the car door would open. Then the car stopped. The crowd hushed, a collective intake of breath. The rear door handle clicked. Sensory details sharpened. The squeak of the hinge, the flash of a camera bulb, the scuff of a polished shoe hitting the asphalt. Bumpy Johnson stepped out. He looked older. His hair was gray. His face was lined with the hard years of Alcatraz. He wore a gray roll coat and leaned heavily on a silver-tipped cane. He stood there, exposed, a sitting duck. Chauncey smiled. "Take the shot," he whispered to the empty air, knowing his men were watching. But the shot didn't come. 11:29 a.m. Silence. 11:30 a.m. Still silence. Bumpy looked up. He didn't look at the crowd. He looked directly at the window of the Palm Cafe. He looked right at Chauncey. And then he smiled. The silence stretched, agonizing and heavy. The crowd sensed something was wrong. The cheering faltered. The wind whipped down Lenox Avenue, biting and cruel. Chauncey grabbed his lieutenant by the collar. "Why are they shooting?" What Chauncey didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had never really left Harlem. His body was in Alcatraz, but his mind had remained on a 125th Street. 5 days prior, the federal transfer. Bumpy knew he was coming home to a war. He knew the young wolves would try to eat him. So he made a call. Not to a hitman, but to a woman. Madame St. Clair, the queen of policy. Though retired and elderly, she still held the keys to the city's heart. Bumpy's move began before he even crossed the George Washington Bridge. He knew Chauncey would use the Hotel Teresa. It was the highest vantage point. It was the obvious tactical choice. So Bumpy had sent a cleaning crew. But not with guns. At 10 a.m. that morning, an hour before Bumpy arrived, 6 maids working at the Hotel Teresa, women who had their rents paid by Bumpy back in the 40s. Grandmothers who remembered when Bumpy saved their sons from prison had entered the room on the 3rd floor. They didn't bring towels. They brought the NYPD. But not just any cops. Bumpy had reached out to the few honest detectives left in the district, men who hated the heroin trade more than they hated the numbers game. He gave them Chauncey's snipers on a silver platter. The twist: the 3 men on the roof weren't looking through scopes. They were handcuffed to the radiators, gagged with their own drop cloths. Back on the street, Bumpy raised his cane. It wasn't a wave to the crowd. It was a signal. From the alleyways behind the Palm Cafe, 20 men emerged. They weren't young soldiers. They were the old guard, men in their 50s and 60s, wearing fedoras and long coats. They were the survivors of the Dutch Schultz Wars. They surrounded the cafe, blocking every exit. Inside, Chauncey's phone at the table rang. He picked it up, his hand trembling. "Welcome to the new management," Bumpy's voice said. Though Bumpy was standing across the street, he was using a payphone booth next to the car. "Check your pocket, Chauncey." Chauncey reached into his suit jacket. He pulled out the ace of spades. Bumpy hadn't put it there. Chauncey's own lieutenant, the man sitting across from him, had slipped it in. "Shames don't lose to men who can't see 3 moves ahead," Bumpy said. "You're relieved of duty." February 12, 1963, 11:45 a.m. The confrontation ended without a single shot fired on 125th Street. The old guard entered the Palm Cafe. They didn't run. They walked with the slow, terrifying confidence of men who have done this 1,000 times. Chauncey St. John was escorted out the back door. He was never seen in Harlem again. Rumors say he ended up in the trunk of a car bound for the Jersey marshes, a gift to the Italians to show that Bumpy was back in charge. The witness reactions were electric. As Bumpy lowered the phone and stepped fully onto the sidewalk, the crowd erupted. It was a sound like thunder. People broke the police barricades. They rushed to touch his coat, to shake his hand. It wasn't just fear, it was respect. The king had returned and he had cleaned house in under 20 minutes. The ripple effects were instantaneous. That afternoon, the price of heroin on the street dropped, then the supply dried up for 3 days as Bumpy reorganized the distribution. He sent word to the Genovese family, "We do business, but we do it my way. No sellin' to kids, no sellin' near churches." Fat Tony Sawerno, respecting the power move, agreed. Bumpy's position was cemented not by violence, but by the demonstration of total control. He proved that, even after a decade in a cage, he knew the heartbeat of Harlem better than the men who walked it every day. He reclaimed his territory without firing a bullet in public, preserving the peace and his legend simultaneously. This moment in 1963 is a masterclass in soft power. Bumpy Johnson understood that violence attracts heat, but intelligence commands respect. By using the community, the maids, the old-timers, the people, he turned the environment into a weapon against his enemies. Historically, this return marked the twilight of the gentleman gangster. Bumpy was the last of a breed. After him, the drug trade would become chaotic and savage, devoid of the code he tried to enforce. He stood as a bridge between the organized rackets of the 30s and the chaotic drug wars of the 70s. The universal lesson is clear: network beats net worth. Chauncey had more money and more guns, but Bumpy had the people. He had built decades of loyalty that served as a sleeping army. When you invest in your community, even as a criminal, that investment pays dividends when your back is against the wall. If this story showed you why Bumpy Johnson was the smartest man to ever walk 125th Street, hit that subscribe button. We are digging up the buried history of organized crime every single week. Drop a like if you respect the chess game. Comment below. Could Bumpy survive in today's underworld? Next week, we cover the true story of how Frank Lucas stole Bumpy's playbook and then broke all the rules.